watching the Mystical Green Beanie.
Hey, what's going on, dudes and dudettes? I am the Mystical Green Beanie, and with Dan Slott's run on Spider-Man officially over, I wanted to take a look back and reflect on it, because for those of you who've watched my videos, you know that this is a run that I've always flip-flopped on. I'd go from loving it, to hating it, to saying it's the worst thing ever, to saying it's wonderful. And at the end of the day, I think I've finally settled on this, and that is that as a whole, I don't think I like this run. I don't think I like this interpretation of Peter Parker's characterization, and I don't think I like the direction that Dan Slott went with this character. That said, there are a lot of redeeming qualities to it, or at the very least, ideas that I think are inspired and lend themselves to the character in a way that makes me scratch my head and wonder why nobody thought to do this with the character before. And something else that I really had to come to terms with is the status quo. Because at the end of the day, Dan Slott didn't choose the post one more day status quo for Peter Parker and Mary Jane Watson. That's just the editorial decision that he had to write around because that's his job as a comic book writer. But I digress. So, without further ado, let's take a look back on Dan Slott's run on The Amazing Spider-Man. So, Dan Slott's run on Spider-Man technically starts with Brand New Day, because a lot of the material from his run starts there, plus he writes the first issue of it and all of that. But Brand New Day was really more of a status quo rebranding effort on Marvel's part, and it had a revolving door of writers and artists for quite some time, actually. And Dan's run doesn't officially start until Spider-Man Big Time, which I don't like at all. Now, before I go guns blazing and tear this thing a new asshole, I do want to stress one thing. I don't think Dan Slott is a bad writer, nor do I think that he has any ill will towards the character of Spider-Man. But based off his 10-year-long run, I think it's safe to say that as much as he probably loves Spider-Man, he clearly doesn't get Spider-Man, but more importantly, he doesn't understand Peter Parker. So one of the major things that I noticed right off the bat when I went back to read Dan's run from the beginning in order to do this video, Dan Slott does not get Peter Parker at all. Because Peter Parker has a very specific characterization, and every writer so far seems to be able to get this characterization, except for Dan. Now, Bendis might write Peter Parker slightly different from Peter David, who writes Peter Parker slightly differently from Jerry Conway, who wrote him differently from J. Michael Straczynski, who wrote him differently from Stan Lee. But at the end of the day, that's just up to those guys having different life experiences and different voices. But even through that, the way they wrote Peter sounded somewhat universal, like they were all writing different shades of the same person. But then there's Dan's interpretation of the character, and I didn't realize this until I started reading through Spider Island, but Dan Slott is writing Peter Parker as though he was the lead writer of a CW-produced Spider-Man series. This feels very much like a Greg Berlanti CW Spider-Man, but, you know, with an endless budget. But yeah, his run feels very CW high school drama, and that can be a good thing, that can work, but that just doesn't work for Spider-Man. And his Peter Parker feels more like a spin-off character of the Flash TV show than anything else. And the same can be said for all the side characters. They feel far less nuanced than Spider-Man supporting characters usually are, and they feel more archetypal. Again, like characters out of a CW show. And that goes not only for newly introduced characters, but classic Spider-Man characters are reduced to this as well, and that really didn't do his run any favors. Which means that a lot of the relationship material is awful by default, which it is. None of it feels realistic or nuanced. It feels fetishized and not real. And I absolutely hate the way he writes women. None of the prominent female characters feel like people. They feel like characters from a soap opera, but not a particularly good one. Like a really bad, poorly translated to English daytime soap opera. And again, this isn't inherently bad. There are comics where this style of writing works perfectly. But Spider-Man just isn't the place for this at all. Dan Slott also does a weird thing that I like to call the Supermanification of Spider-Man, because when reading through it, I came to the realization that if this were a Superman book, then I'd probably like it a little more, because the tone that Dan Slott gives this book feels very similar to that of Jeff Johns' Action Comics. It feels like a TV show with no budget, and everybody behaves like a dramatized characterization of their John Byrne, Dan Jurgens, and Louise Simonson counterparts. And even though that wasn't my thing personally, it's still something that worked for a character like Superman. Because DC characters, I feel, are more tonally flexible by virtue of that universe being more heightened and less, quote-unquote, realistic. But I also bring that up because Dan Slott really wants Spider-Man to be Superman. And I say that for two main reasons. The first being that Dan Slott writes Spider-Man's interaction with the citizens of New York to be very much like that of Spider-Man and the citizens of Metropolis. He's this shining role model for kids, and everybody in the city loves him, and he's this shining example of heroism. This is literally the one complaint that I have slated against every version of Spider-Man in the movies, and it's that everybody loves him. And they shouldn't. I mean, sure, there would be people in the city of New York who love Spider-Man, but there should also be people who hate him, or don't trust him, and aren't afraid to let him know that, or at the very least, people wouldn't kneel at his feet. They'd talk to him like they talk to any other New Yorker. And I probably shouldn't talk about this because it'll date this video, but whatever, I don't care. So, in the Spider-Man video game that's coming out for the PS4 from Insomniac Games, one of the things I like about that game is that when you're playing as Spider-Man and you're walking around the streets, you'll be able to interact with civilians. And some will take selfies with you, while others will inform you about what's going on in the city. Meanwhile, some are going to start pulling out guns and start shooting at you because Spider-Man is a fairly controversial figure in New York. Some people love him, and some people hate him. And that's the reaction that people of New York should have towards Spider-Man. And Dan Slott does not take that approach. And the second reason why I say that Dan's Spider-Man book feels more like a Superman book is because the stories themselves were too grand scale. Granted, not a lot of them were. Big Time, ironically, was a relatively small scale story. Same with No Turning Back. Even though that's the story where Dan Slott ruins Curtis Connors. But for the most part, Dan Slott's Spider-Man stories consist of Peter Parker dealing with major world-ending catastrophes. Which, don't get me wrong, I'm fine with Spider-Man saving the world, but not on a daily basis like Superman. Spider-Man stories are often great when they focus on the more smaller scale threats like gangsters and crime lords and assassins and whatnot. So stories like Ends of the Earth and Spider Island and stuff like that just felt too big in scope for my liking. But those stories were nothing compared to Spider-Verse. Oh my god. So, a little over a year ago, I recorded a review for Spider-Verse, which I chose not to upload because it was just too toxic and angry, and even talking about it right now is bringing back some of those feelings. And I don't want to get too deep into it, but Spider-Verse is a great video game pitch. And by that I mean, Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions was a fun video game. But that is not the type of story that you're supposed to tell in a Spider-Man comic. And I'm going to sound like a broken record when I say this, but this is a Superman plot. This is the type of story that you tell when you're writing a Superman comic, or if you're Grant Morrison or Scott Snyder, a Batman comic. Plus, the storyline itself was awful. It's one of those events where literally every tie-in was an integral piece of a larger puzzle. And that's just the thing I hate with comics regardless. And then there was the whole Parker Industries thing, which started horribly, and it ended horribly. And Peter Parker was a discount Tony Stark, and that whole era of Spider-Man is just dreadful. And the way it ends, with Peter losing the company, and he's now this defamed former billionaire, it just feels like Dan Slott broke Spider-Man. Like, I know that Peter Parker stories are still going to be published and all of that, but Peter Parker, just as a character, feels fundamentally broken after the whole worldwide era, which I think it's officially called. But speaking of Parker Industries, I should also probably bring up the whole Superior Spider-Man era, which jumpstarts that status quo. And as I said on the channel before, I actually really liked this era of Spider-Man. Mainly because, well, it wasn't Dan Slott writing Spider-Man. It was Dan Slott writing Dr. Octopus. And I think that he has a really good command over the character of Otto Octavius. Plus, all of the character building of Otto as a superhero was fascinating. I love seeing how he went from wanting nothing but to destroy Peter Parker to trying his best to not only be a good hero and a superior Spider-Man than Peter Parker was, but trying his best to be a good person and lead a more productive life which would better the world around him. I mean, he was still a dick by virtue of him being who he was, but it's just that notion of being given a second chance and seeing what he did with the opportunity that he stole in hijacking Peter Parker's body and doing all the things that he wished he could do as Otto Octavius. And like I said, I loved the ideas that Dan Slott came up with, to the point where some of them were so obvious, it makes me scratch my head and wonder why nobody ever thought to do this with the character before. And the main thing I'm getting at is Peter's job at the Horizon Labs think tank. Now, to be frank, I didn't like Dan Slott's approach to writing the other scientists and whatnot. It felt too Big Bang Theory for my taste. But then again, that's just Dan Slott's writing style. But regardless of all that, the notion of Peter Parker being a professional scientist is one that really excites me, because as much as I love the status quo of Peter Parker being a school teacher and having a regular job, him working in a lab with other professional scientists works out very well for his character, especially if Marvel is worried that working with children will make Peter come off as old. Plus, there was a really beautifully written and drawn scene by Dan Slott and, I believe, Humberto Ramos, where Peter is off to his first day to work at Horizon Labs, and Aunt May's there to see him off, and there's this flashback panel to The Amazing Spider-Man issue number 1, where Aunt May remembers, just after Uncle Ben's death, Peter tells her that he's going to drop out of school and get a job, and Aunt May tells him to stay in school so that he can become a scientist like he always dreamed of. And then she looks up, and she tells Ben that Peter did it. He finally did it. And it's a status quo that I wish had stayed, not because I'm against characters moving on or anything like that, but because I just didn't like where Peter Parker goes from there, because that's where we get all the Parker Industries material, which worked out for Doc Ock and Superior Spider-Man, but not so much once the title reverted back to being about Peter Parker. But yeah, guys, all in all, I was not a fan of this decade-long run on Spider-Man. There were certainly stories that I enjoyed and concepts that he introduced to the Spider-Man mythology that I'm grateful for, but at the end of the day, I can't lie through my teeth and tell you guys that I'm sad that Dan Slott is leaving the book. Because ultimately, even though he claims to be a huge fan, which I don't doubt for a second, I don't think he understands Peter Parker or the world of Spider-Man. He wrote The Amazing Spider-Man as though he were writing a primetime geek comedy sitcom, and that tone just does not mesh well with Spider-Man in my opinion. And the only consistent thing that I can say that I loved about his run across the board was the art. Even though I'm in the minority on that, I still think Humberto Ramos, for the most part, did a great job. And I was also a huge fan of Giuseppe Camuncoli. But yeah, those are my thoughts regarding Dan Slott's run on Spider-Man. But what about you? Were you into it? Were you not? Let me know down below in the comment section. Also, if you liked this video, hit the like button to share support the channel. And if you want to see more content like this, all you have to do is subscribe. I'm the Mystical Green Beanie. Thank you for watching. And as always, until next time, adios nachos, adios.